Jason Kenney is literally tanking Alberta. You know things are bad when Alberta Premier Jason Kenney first blames Trudeau for the dead Keystone XL pipeline. Then he threatens economic sanctions against the United States unless they revive the pipeline. And then, as a last resort, Kenney appears on Fox News to beg the U.S. to revive the twice-dead pipeline. So embarrassing! No one even watches Fox News! To say that Jason Kenney is tanking Alberta is a gross understatement. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is literally beset with woes. Woes he believes are caused by everybody else but himself. And his list of people to blame for his own poor leadership decisions continues to grow. His naughty list includes, obviously, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, now US President Joe Biden, actors like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jane Fonda, unnamed lawless Indigenous land defenders, so-called leftist green zealots and urban militants, Albertans, and oh, don't forget, yours truly and David Suzuki. Kenney blames us for TechMine pulling up stakes, for Keystone XL dying not one but 2 deaths, and even has the audacity to imply that the runaway COVID rates in Alberta is the fault of Albertans. The reality is that the only person to blame for Alberta's economic and social woes is the one in charge, Jason Kenney. At the outset of the pandemic, Kenney was publicly critical about pandemic safety measures like mandatory face masks or time-limited lockdowns. His equivocation about pandemic measures sent mixed messages to Albertans at a time when Albertans needed strong leadership based on pandemic science. Seeing pictures of Kenney and his senior officials in meetings without face masks, and the fact that at least 6 UCP MLAs and his own chief of staff traveled outside of Canada during the holidays, all in violation of their own health advice, are just a few examples of the many ways in which Kenney continues to demonstrate poor pandemic leadership. Instead of prioritizing human health and well-being, Kenney has mused mostly about the impact on businesses. And it should be no surprise that his province has the second highest rate of COVID in all of Canada. Kenney appears to have also used the pandemic as a cover to make cuts to social programs like education, creating layoffs at a time when people really needed their jobs. Many saw this as a political attempt to force the federal government to bear the costs of the pandemic. Okay, fair enough, Kenney. But even when the feds came through with significant emergency measures funding for Alberta, Kenney sat on it. According to the recent report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Alberta received the most financial support from the federal government on a per capita basis. But, unbeknownst to Albertans, Kenney has been sitting on the highest amount of unspent federal monies, more than $675 million. To my mind, that is just unconscionable not to spend every available dollar to support Albertans through this pandemic. I mean, imagine what those funds could have done to help Albertans in terms of housing supports, wage subsidies, or all those educators who were impacted by Kenney's cuts. Meanwhile, Kenney's pro-oil war room has not only wasted millions of dollars in really embarrassing oil propaganda, but according to some analysts, may in fact cost Alberta millions in global investments. Kenney simply can't keep picking public fights with Indigenous peoples, scientists, academics, journalists, and other countries and not expect that that's going to have consequences for Alberta. Albertans need a leader with vision that is based in the reality of our collective circumstances, not a Trump-style runaway train. The world is transitioning to sustainable energy resources and strengthening climate change measures. And even banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and investment firms can see the writing on the climate change wall. Kenny's steadfast commitment to oil seems to be more about ego at this point than what's in the best interest of Albertans. Kenny's actions are increasingly irrational and seem more Trump-style than those of a leader that has the legal and moral responsibility to carry Albertans through this pandemic and all of the other social challenges like poverty, homelessness, racism, and climate change. I mean, right in the middle of a pandemic, when people were worried about whether or not they'd be able to feed their families, Kenney commits $1.5 billion to revive a dead pipeline, Keystone XL. Not only was this a shock to most people, but it showed Kenney's inability to see the political writing on the wall. We all knew that Trump's days were numbered, and Joe Biden had already given us a heads up that if he was elected, he'd revoke the permits for Keystone XL. And he did, to no one's surprise but Kenney's. Instead of taking the time to regroup and work across party lines and in partnership with First Nations to create a sustainable economic path forward, his knee-jerk reaction was to threaten the United States with economic sanctions and then blame Trudeau for the death of Keystone XL. This was literally the same tactic Kenney used to deflect responsibility for his lack of economic leadership when Teck Resources pulled out of the proposed oil sands mining project. This is despite the fact that many economists had already indicated that the mine wouldn't even be economically viable.
So to the David Suzukis of the world and their fellow travelers, to the Pam Palmatiers and all the rest of them.
Instead, Kenney made a bizarre press release where he blamed actors like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jane Fonda, together with so-called urban militants like David Suzuki and Pam Palmater, for Teck Resources leaving. It should be no surprise that Kenney's approval ratings have taken a massive nosedive. According to an Angus Reid poll released just weeks ago, Kenney's approval rating has fallen from 61% in June of 2019 to 40% in December of 2020. That makes him in the bottom two, alongside Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister, as the worst premiers in the country. The majority of Albertans don't even support him, and Alberta continues to rank as one of the worst provinces in terms of COVID. Meanwhile, Alberta officials refuse to make the province's R value, the reproductive number of COVID, public. That's a type of secrecy that does not instill confidence that their premier can lead Albertans safely out of the pandemic. We are all so tired of hearing Kenney complain about his self-inflicted woes in the media. His latest appearance on Fox News to ask for his pipeline money back was not only embarrassing for Albertans, but for all Canadians. Kenney needs to stop complaining to Trudeau about Western alienation and have a look in the mirror. The only one alienating Alberta is Kenney. It's long past time for Kenney to step up as a leader or move over for someone who can inspire hope, health, and well-being for Albertans now and for generations to come. Thank you, as always, for watching, listening, sharing, and taking action to demand accountability from all leaders in Canada, including Jason Kenney. And don't forget to follow me on TikTok as PP2Cool for your daily dose of PAM news, a native twist on the day's top stories. Till next time, stay alert, warriors.